Hey, Slater Crusaders, America's the greatest country in the world. Happy Monday. Glad you're here. Hope you had a great weekend. We are going to stay on this theme of the woke cult, Black Lives Matter, just everything that's going on around us. And we're going to keep exploring not only the philosophy of the people who are leading this Marxist revolution that we're in the midst of, but also exploring who we are. Right, what this country was founded on, philosophically, because we can't fight against what's going on if we can't define that, and we can't defend who we are if we can't define that. And I'll admit I have been woefully unprepared for this battle. So I have a lot of catching up to do, and I hope we can do it together here. James Lindsay is one of the most important people in this moment right now. We talked to him on Friday. We had such an amazing special on Friday. Please download the app in the App Store. Search for The First TV in the App Store, and you can watch all the specials that we've done, all the episodes that we've done. But please go back and watch the special we did on Friday. We had 3 amazing guests, and James Lindsay was one of them from newdiscourses.com. And I think this is the last question. This was right after he said, sometimes he doesn't feel like he's doing well. He spends all of his time going into the literature and like plugging into this matrix. And it's affecting him physically and emotionally and spiritually. And it's not good for you. But that's what he's doing for us. Anyway, so he said he's not doing well. And he talked about how he needs to plug into the matrix and then unplug. Otherwise he's going to go completely crazy. And then I asked him why this matters to us. All this Marxist stuff that's going on out there. Why does it really matter to us long term? Here's what he said. Why does this affect me? Why does this affect my kids and grandkids today and in the next X number of years?
Well, if you don't actually know how things work and all you do is complain, you're not building anything, and you're not building anything that works in particular. And so we do, and I know it's a bit extreme, and I don't want to throw DEFCON 5 up here, but we do run the risk of civilizational collapse if we are, one, replacing competent people with people whose, I'm not saying anything about anybody in particular being competent, but their focus is on this diversity, equity, inclusion, justice program that's automatically diverting resources away from making sure that the air traffic controllers are if they're focusing on diversity, every minute they spend doing that, they're not focusing on making sure airplanes don't run into each other or that they have safe landings. So stuff actually works. I mean, we saw with the coronavirus where the meatpacking plants ended up getting shut down because of virus outbreaks, and we were literally at risk of our entire food supply chain collapsing. You have to have people who know how things work running things and focusing on making them work rather than focusing on this endless, identity-based feelings type argument. No experiment with kind of collective communist style identity or whatever has ever worked. Every single example in history has collapsed and done so catastrophically. And there's every reason to believe that this is just more of the same program. So this is a risky moment. Plus, nobody, I don't think, enjoys having their friends and family throw them out of their lives.
Yeah. I know you tweeted the other day, someone whose wife, called him a racist because they had white fragility and now their husband's a racist. It's what do we...
Yeah, I'm getting this from interracial couples. I'm getting an email from them nearly every day.
A couple points on this. So I just came across this. I'm reading this book called David's Sling. It's an art history book. It's called David's Sling, A History of Democracy in 10 Works of Art. And the author, she has her doctorate in art history from the University of Pennsylvania. And she was national security advisor to Ted Cruz, which is like a weird combination. You're an art history major and a national security advisor. And I think she had some role in the White House or still does, I'm not sure. But I read this chapter this weekend about David, the statue David, and Florence in general. So I think the Florence Cathedral is the most beautiful building in the world. Do we have a picture of this, guys? There you go. That is absolutely stunning to me. I think that's the most beautiful building in the world. Look at that. Unbelievable. It just dominates the skyline in such an unbelievable way. Okay. So Florence was becoming a very important city in around the 1200s, and they decided to rebuild that cathedral. And what they designed, no one had attempted to build a cathedral like this since the fall of the Western Roman Empire in about the year 500. All right, so 700 years have passed since they decided to build a building like this. This is from the book. The Romans' engineering secrets had followed the ancients into the darkness. Still, the Florentines proceeded with the plan, starting at the east end in 1296 and working their way down the nave, assuming that by the time they got to the crossing, the dome, someone would have figured out how to build it. What? They didn't. I'm sorry. So they started building, and they're like, well, we don't know how to build a dome, but I don't know, we'll figure it out. We have this impression, I do, because it's been true our entire lives, that things have always and will always just get better. That we will always advance and will always stand on the shoulders of the giants who came before us, and all the things that have been known will continue to just be known forever. How can we as a people, as an entire city in this case, not know how to do something that we used to know how to do? Isn't that wild? Like, hey, we should build this dome. Who knows how to build a dome? No one? No one knows how to build a dome? Well, we did 700 years ago, but now we don't? How can that be? We think that things just get hardwired in our brain. Like someone knows something and then it's hardwired in the brain and then we just have it forever. It's not true at all. This is one of my favorite stand-up bits. This is from Nate Bargatze. So we have cell phones today. I don't know how cell phones work. Do you know how a cell phone works? So we assume, because again, we've been like this our entire lives, that we'll always have cell phones and cell phones will always work and we'll always have pieces of metal floating up in the sky and it'll all work. But if we lost the people who can make cell phones and know how cell phones work, then there won't be any cell phones anymore. But do that not only with technology, now do that with ideas. Ideas like freedom and liberty and individual rights, all the things that our country was built on. This line's become a bit trite, perhaps, but it's true. Reagan said it. Freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We did not pass it on to our children in the bloodstream. It must be fought for, protected, handed on to them to do the same. Or one day we'll be spending our sunset years telling our children, our children's children, what it was once like to live in the United States where men were free. In Florence, no one knew how to build the dome anymore. They didn't know how. It wasn't passed on through their bloodstream. So this one guy, his name's Filippo Brunelleschi or something like that. He went to the ancient Roman ruins to try and figure it out and try to reverse engineer, and he did it. And then they started building. It took them 16 years to build it, and it was completed in 1436. It took 140 years to build the cathedral. The guy who engineered the dome was born 81 years after they started building. Right? So they're sitting around, they're like, I don't know, someone will figure out. 81 years later, that guy was born before he, and then obviously grew up and could start to figure it out before that. Isn't that amazing? But there was no guarantee that that guy was ever gonna be born and figure it out. Similar with the statue of David, right? So in Florence, they had this giant piece of marble, right? Nothing's been quarried for hundreds of years that was this giant. And no one knew what to do with it. It was 15 feet long, 6 tons, but it was long and narrow. And they didn't know what to do. So the people who were in charge of building the cathedral, just like they started building the cathedral without knowing how to build the dome, they were just like, well, maybe one day someone will know what to do with this piece of marble. And they didn't think they could build anything with it because it was too narrow and too heavy. And like if they built a person, then the ankles would break, right? So it was quarried in 1464. And some other sculptors tried to do something with it, but they stopped. They said it couldn't be done. So it just sat outside. Some people thought about breaking it up into smaller pieces. And so it was 1464 it was quarried. It wasn't until 1501 when Michelangelo took a stab at it. And he finished in 1503. Michelangelo was born 11 years after the rock was quarried. Now, these are two absolutely brilliant men. But the point is, people once knew how to do this stuff and then forgot for hundreds of years. And I argue that we could do the same thing with the ideas that we have in this American experiment. We can forget them for hundreds of years. Now, the truth is, if you want to be super cynical, I say these ideas could be forgotten. I wonder how much they were even ever known. This is such a revolutionary idea that we're living in, and everything's been so taken for granted. And I feel like people don't even feel like it needs to be learned in the first place. And these are the ideas that are under direct assault. But this time we're living in, this is the anomaly. You lose it, we'll just go back to the way things have always been. And what, maybe just pray that in a couple hundred years from now, someone will try it again? So our job, because of all that, twofold. First, understand deeply the terrible philosophy of Marxism and postmodernism that we're living in today, and understand the uniqueness of who we are. If we don't know postmodernism, we can't attack it. If we don't know who we are, we can't defend it. So we have to do this today. We have to do it with courage and humility and love. We have to stand for even the concept that truth exists. Because freedom's never more than one generation away from extinction. True story. Mike Slater, spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, please, I beg of you, check out our app on the App Store, and you can go back and watch the special that we did on Friday about cancel culture. It was amazing. And please watch the James Lindsay interview and go to newdiscourses.com. That's his website. They have amazing stuff there every single day. He is really leading the charge here, and I'm super grateful to talk to him. So I think this was my opening question. I said, who started this? where we are today, you can go back to Marx, but like, how did we get here? Here's what he said. Tinder has been laid for decades that we're now just starting to light on fire. Do you find that to be accurate?
That is 100% accurate.
Okay.
Yeah, it goes
Can you
back
give us
to...
who started this stuff?
I mean, it depends on how you want to read these things. You know, philosophical currents aren't, one guy just started everything and then it just took off. Marx had a particular reading of Hegel, if you want to get into the philosophy side of it. And Marx's reading of Hegel allowed him to create conflict theory, which sees society in stratified groups that are in zero-sum war with one another for opportunity and resources. He saw it economically in the 1930s, where you're referring to the Frankfurt School. The neo-Marxists, as they were called, created a new way of looking at it. The Marxist revolutions didn't take place, so they said, well, it must not be economics, it must be culture, it must be ideology, it must be that the elites in society are brainwashing everybody to think the way they want them to think so that they'll vote against their own interests and in the interests of the elites. And then that is really where that ball has been rolling, with the concept of cultural hegemony, which is that elites telling everybody how to think and making them think along their lines. And that developed through the kind of very radical 50s and 60s, where you had, the kind of post-war Frankfurt School, Herbert Marcuse laying down repressive tolerance, saying that we have to be absolutely intolerant of anything that can lead to intolerance. But then he also says that in the post-fascist world, we're always in the emergency of the emergence of fascism. So we have to act as though fascism is around every corner, so everything's an emergency. And he says that revolutionary violence is justifiable. In fact, he says violence is always unethical, but there's a difference between reactionary and revolutionary violence. And when have ethics ever mattered in the making of history? And so right after he wrote that in 1965, what did we end up with? Race riots across the country in 1967 and 1968. So that went underground, whether underground actually, but that went underground for a couple of decades, mostly went into the academy, following what Antonio Gramsci laid out as the so-called long march through the institutions. And our universities have basically been slowly turning into think tanks that develop and teach this ideology to our young people. And it's in the 1990s, it fused with postmodern theory so that truth no longer matters. And it became this very complicated thing that sees systemic injustice everywhere. It's perpetuated in the uses of language and the way people think and what we consider to be fact and fiction.
It's so brilliant. Okay, so you see me, I'm usually when we do always when we do these interviews, I'm taking notes. And I'm like, this is a lot of get back to this later, do more research on this. So one of the notes I took was on repressive tolerance. Did you hear him say that? So he said that, I was like, I don't know what that is. I've never heard of repressive tolerance before. So here it is. This is Tyler Brandt on Marcuse. So Herbert Marcuse is a German philosopher. He was in the Frankfurt School in the 1930s, which was an important part of this whole story. So here's Tyler Brandt paraphrasing Marcuse. Free speech and tolerance, we think of as good things, are only beneficial when they exist in conditions of absolute equality. But in his world, there is no absolute equality. Therefore, they're not good. When there are power differentials at play, however, which there most certainly always will be, then free speech and tolerance are only beneficial to the already powerful. So free speech and tolerance, things that we believe are virtues, Herbert Marcuse said they are not. They're master's tools to continue oppression. So like an example of this would be if you steal something from the store, of course that's theft and you go to jail. But as AOC said, she said it this week and I saw it this morning, and so it's gonna be kind of more news today. But AOC said if someone who is poor is stealing something from the store, it's a virtuous sign for providing for their family. They're just buying bread. They're not buying anything. They're stealing bread for their family, right? I'm sure you've seen all the looting, people stealing TVs, but AOC sees poor people stealing bread, right? Now, it's because they're in an oppressed group and can do no wrong, and you are in a powerful group and can do no right. This is how the left gets away. It's called, again, repressive tolerance. This is how the left gets away with calling for free speech while canceling people, right? They claim to support free speech while canceling people because to them, the people that they're canceling are the oppressors. And they are merely the oppressed people taking down the powerful so that we can all truly have free speech and tolerance. Do you see the perverted thinking of that? That's how they excuse their hypocrisy. So Marcuse made up this idea of liberating tolerance, which is the other term he used, liberating tolerance, which represses the strong, empowers the weak. So when you hear kids today on the left talk about tolerance, they don't mean tolerance. like you and I, like when we think tolerance, we think, oh, we're going to allow something to exist or someone to say something that we disagree with, and I'll be tolerant of that viewpoint, right? They say tolerance, and they mean silencing or canceling of that person because you or they are the oppressor. Marcuse literally wrote, he said, liberating tolerance would mean intolerance against movements from the right and toleration of movements from the left. He literally could not be more clear about it. So tolerance, just the idea of it has been flipped from a good thing into a weapon itself, where the left can do no wrong because they're virtuous and the right are oppressors no matter what. So small example of this, and there's small ones and big ones all across the spectrum, but this video I remember seeing weeks ago, some people sprayed Black Lives Matter on this building, and that's, of course, virtuous because they're the oppressed and they can do no wrong, right? This is the voice of the oppressed, right? So they're virtuous. What they did, they spray painted on a building. But if someone comes up and cleans it, that's oppression. Here's one very nice woman making note of this.
Why are you guys removing Black Lives Matter's graffiti?
We're just trying to take care of the Yeah, we tried over there and it wasn't coming off. It's still not was coming off.
But why do you want that to come off?
Well, because this is a federal building. Yeah, it's just a vandalism.
But so you don't care about Black Lives then?
Not at all. That's not at all what we're saying.
That's what this,
We certainly do care about Black Lives.
not enough to leave up a message.
You don't disagree with the message, ma'am. It's just on the building. We're just trying to clean it.
Right. Not a great way to use your white privilege, ladies. Not a great. That's disgusting.
She seems nice. This is why you also have the anti-fascist, Antifa, using fascism to fight fascism. Right? So that's what this is. It's liberating tolerance. They've institutionalized hypocrisy. They've turned hypocrisy into a virtue. Here's another. So at the end of that clip there, James Lindsay talked about reality. And there's literally no such thing as reality. Remember last like Wednesday or so, we did an overview of pre-Enlightenment, Enlightenment, and now postmodern views of the 5 different questions of philosophy. And one of them is about reality, metaphysics. And to the postmodern, so I guess the pre-Enlightenment was, God and the heavenly realms and the world. Enlightenment was like, there basically is no God, it's just reality, it's just what you can touch and feel. And now postmodern is there's no reality, doesn't exist. I will not even entertain questions about what exists and what doesn't. There's no such thing as anything. Okay? It's all about, therefore, how you feel. We're going to do another segment someday this week about this, where if there's no reality, if there's no reason, there's no logic, there's no reality, what's the world based on? It's based on feeling. That's it. It's entirely based about feelings. We're going to do a segment on a math textbook called Rethinking Mathematics, and it's a social justice math textbook. And we'll give some examples of it. It's appalling. Like once you read this, once you hear about this, you'll never send your kids to a public school ever again. Because this has been thoroughly infused in everything that they do, even math class. We'll talk about that later. But at the end of every assignment, where they talk about like how our founding fathers were slave owners and income inequality and all this stuff, all this social justice grievance stuff, at the end of it, they ask kids to write an essay on how they feel. How do they feel about this? In math class. And sometimes because the written word is an aspect of the white patriarchy and the oppressive class, you can either write an essay or you can make a poster talking about how you feel. If this was when I was in school, I would make so many posters. I would be the king of posters. You don't have to do anything. But that's what happens when there's no reason, logic, or reality. It's all about how you feel. Anyway, there is no reality. So here's a current example of this when it relates to COVID. So all I'm hearing about this last week is how Texas, Arizona, and Florida are awful and off the charts, and everything's terrible when it comes to COVID. And by contrast, New Jersey, New York, and Connecticut are just fantastic. They're just the pillars of everything we need to be. And Dr. Gottlieb and others have made this claim that New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut, they sought to crush the virus up front, but the red states, Florida, Texas, and Arizona, they did the more Swedish model to try to manage the spread. And look how horribly it's going on in these red states, right? So can we throw up the Ben Shapiro tweet so we can all see this? This is deaths per million. And this is a good metric because it adjusts for population differences, right? So this is deaths per million. And you can see in New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, between, let's say it's a average 1,600 deaths per million. Texas has 105. The crush the virus blue states have a death per million rate of over 10 times as high. New York Times wrote a whole article about how churches are a major source of COVID spread. And you're like, oh geez, I wonder how bad this is. 650 cases, not deaths, cases in the entire country. That's less than half the cases in Florida that have started from people coming from New York to Florida. Over twice as many cases just from that as there have been in cases from churches in the country. But reality doesn't matter. It's all about how I feel. And I feel like the red states have done the bad thing. Society cannot function on feelings. But when you throw away reason, logic, and reality, what do you got left? True story. Mike Slater, spread the word. Hey, Settlers, let's see this oppressor versus oppressed paradigm at work here. And what happens when you view the world through the lens of Marxism? You see that paradigm everywhere, even when it's not really there. So this is a headline from Newsweek. There's a billion headlines, but we just chose the Newsweek one. Do you guys have it here? I don't have it in front of me. Rising death rates among white Americans caused by misperceived threat to their dominant social status. So the paper is called Growing Sense of Social Status Threat and Concomitant Deaths of Despair Among Whites. This is from the study guy, the scientist. The anxiety of whites is coming from a misperception that their dominant status in society is being threatened, which is manifesting in multiple forms of psychological and physiological stress, which is leading to a rise in the deaths of despair. So deaths of despair are suicide, alcohol consumption, opioid overdoses, stuff like that. So we see those things going up. What's the cause of it? White people see their power structures being threatened. All right? That's the claim that the study makes, right? That whites have they view this threat to their dominant social status, and therefore they're taking drugs and drinking and committing suicide. It's quite a claim. So because I'm white and we, all white people, because there's no such thing as an individual, it's only the collective. So I view that my whole social structure, which used to be on top of the world, is now, I see the black people taking over and all these Indians and these colored folk taken away. Folk, by the way, is a woke term. It's a gender neutral term instead of guys. Hey guys, or ladies and gentlemen, you say folk, F-O-L-X. You can say folks too. Anyway, all these folks are taking away my power, so I'm gonna take drugs and commit suicide. That's the argument. So, a couple of things. First of all, white people have always been poor too. Talk to a low-income white person today, or 50 years ago, 100 years ago, and tell them about white privilege. Makes no sense to them. What are you talking about? You live in a trailer in West Virginia, someone's gonna come up to you and talk about your white privilege? So how do you account for the loss of social status among white people who never had a social status? That's one problem. Here's the main point. The whole basis of the study is this idea of perceived threat. How do you measure perceived threat to someone's status? It's not even to someone's status, like a person, to a group's status. How could you possibly measure such a ridiculous thing? Perceived threat to white people's status. How do you measure that? That's not a scientific thing you can measure. That's why I get so annoyed at these scientists doing their studies. Like, what are you talking about? You can measure height, you can measure distance, you can measure death rates per 100,000 people like we did a second ago. How do you measure a group's perceived threat? So this is what they did. They measured the change in the share of Republican voters in a county. Okay, so it used to be 60% Republican voters, now it's 40% Republican voters. That change is the indicator of perceived racial threat. That's their words, racial threat. That is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. So I can just take the city council district that I live here in San Diego. So San Diego, ridiculous California, but there's always been this little bastion of conservatism that is San Diego on the way bottom, right on the border of Mexico here. That bastion of conservatism is losing big time. I think in the mayor's race, they don't even have a Republican running this go around. We have a Republican mayor right now. We don't even have a Republican running for the mayor's race right now. Okay? We have 9 city council districts. The one that I live in used to be solidly Republican. I think it's the 9th district, whatever. It used to be solidly Republican. The Republican may lose this election, which is shocking for San Diego. Never would one have ever thought that was possible. And this is the one I live in. I don't view that as a perceived racial threat, right? I don't like the political change of the district, but a racial threat, right? So you get 2 points here. First, everything to the left is racial. Everything is racial. And everything has to be seen through a power prism. Everything. Even like the really sad reality of why a lot of, in this case, white people, but a lot of people are more committed, people are committing suicide and opioid overdose, whatever. It's like, oh, power, Marxist power struggle. No, guys. Can you think of a more damaging effect? Let's just focus on kids, especially kids of lower income families or broken families, telling them that you can't make it, you have no hope, there's nothing you can do to be successful in this world. Everything's rigged against you. Can you think of a worse poison than that? Can you stunt the growth of a child more than by telling them that the entire system they live in is racist and against you from succeeding? And then tell them on top, if you do succeed, white people are going to commit suicide because of it. And also, white people, you should despair because this revolution's in full steam right now and you are going to feel now what it's like to be oppressed. That's not a well-functioning society. We're going to do a segment this week on justice and how the woke cult, how they view justice. So in the Christian world, justice is love, harmony, empathy, thoughtfulness, and caring. To the left, justice is revenge and destruction. Choose your society wisely. Coming up next, our weekly check-in with Professor Vincent Racaniello about COVID. Coming up, true story. Mike Slater, spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders. Always so grateful for the professor of virology at Columbia University. Like, this is a bonkers to me that we get to talk to the professor of virology at Columbia. Like, he's the guy. And he's got a podcast called This Week in Virology. And microbe.tv is the website. And you should definitely check all that out. Professor Rackaniello, how are you, sir?
I'm well. I'm very glad that you like having me on. I appreciate coming and explaining things to you.
Well, I appreciate being explained to. It's wild because, like, I'm so grateful because you're in the academic world, obviously, and I'm in, like, not. So I'm grateful that you can bridge this for me and for all of us listening. Because we can't be living in our own little circles, because that doesn't do anyone any good. Let me ask you a couple basic questions, then I want to get some stuff from your podcast last week, some of the more sciencey stuff. So just read this article, immunity to COVID-19 could be lost in months. And this is a King's College London team. Talked about 3 months of antibody, whatever. What's the latest with what we know about how long immunity lasts?
All right, so let's put this in perspective with other coronaviruses, right? Because there are 4 other coronaviruses that infect humans all the time, right? That we've known about them since the 60s. They cause common colds, pretty mild infections. When you get infected with one of those, typically the first time you do in the first 10 years of your life, you make antibodies. And then within 6 months, they go down, very low levels. So you get reinfected, but you don't get serious disease ever after that. And you keep getting reinfected every year, so it doesn't last. So I think this is going to turn out to be the same for SARS-CoV-2. I think if you measure antibodies, you'll see they go down, but you're not going to get serious disease if you get reinfected. Okay, so that's the thing you have to remember.
Yeah, I remember we talked about that before. So you still believe that's the case, that you may still get it, you just won't get really sick. But again, it's still true that you could still spread it.
That's right.
A second time.
That's right.
Okay.
Immunity probably does not impair you from spreading it, right?
Okay, which leads me to another study that I believe I got from your website. Temporal dynamics in viral shedding and transmissibility of COVID-19. What are temporal dynamics in viral shedding?
So the viral shedding means what's coming out of your nose and mouth as you're sneezing and coughing and speaking in the droplets, right? And temporal simply means with time. So this study was really important because they said, when do people shed virus in the course of the disease? And basically it starts even before you have symptoms. It's the pre-symptomatic stage, a couple of days before you start shedding. When you have symptoms, that first day that you get cough and so forth, that is almost peaked. It then peaks about a day after your symptoms have started, and then within 7 days, it's gone way down. All right, so that's really happens fast. That's the key. But more importantly, you're shedding before you know you're sick, and that's why this virus is so good at spreading.
That's the worst part. Okay, so just to reiterate that, so the day after you show symptoms is your peak shedding.
Right. And that's when you're most infectious for other people.
Yes. Even if your symptoms like just a little bit of a sore throat on day 1, that still counts.
That's right. That's right. And I remember,
interesting. So it's not
most people, in those 7 days, they'll be fine. But then a subset, 20% or so, they go on to have the immune complex disease, lung damage, and all of that, which happens afterwards. But the virus is already way down by then. That's the key.
Okay, let me show, this is getting too personal because I want to keep it general. But a friend of mine went to work for the first time. All right, went to work for the first time in a pretty closed environment. Someone at her work had symptoms, fever, sore throat, worked all day. Someone who worked with her that day went to work the next day with my friend also there. And my friend was worried that this in-between person was passing it on. And my thought was, no, because there wasn't enough time for this second person to shed enough virus to get you sick. What do you think?
Well, first of all, it may not have been COVID-19, right? There are other viruses that could make you sick. That's really important to remember. But if you have a symptom, you're shedding. If it's early on in your symptom course of infection, you're shedding. Now, if it's been 10 days since you got sick, then you're probably minimally infectious for someone else.
Okay. What is the, I want to talk about so we talked about antibodies, and I asked you before the show if I should get an antibody test. And you said yes, but be mindful that even if you get a positive test, it may not necessarily be the case. And is this what a serological assay is? What's an assay? Assays.
Serological assay. An assay is a test where you measure something. So you can assay for virus, antibodies. You could assay for caffeine in your blood. Whatever you want to measure, that's an assay. Something we do in the lab. Okay.
So you asked someone who deals with that, and she said she gave a very high number, like 98, 99%. Does that mean it's very accurate?
So her test that she developed at Mount Sinai, which she said is the best, and she said it's 98, 99% accurate, which is great. And that's the test that everyone should use, of course, but they're not. Lots and lots of tests out there because different companies want to make money on them. And so none of them, they're not all as good. But hers, she gives away. Anybody who wants this test, she will give you the protocol. She will give you all the things you need to do it. And you can get it. It's great. I think this is the way the science should be working, right?
Yeah. What about a saliva test? Because I could go down the street to the CVS and I have to stick the thing up in the back of my brain in order to get a test. You have to do it yourself. So spitting in a jar is way better. So what's the deal with that?
So I asked Daniel Griffin about that on Thursday, and he said, yes, you can do saliva. I asked her, Viviana Simon, on Friday. She said yes. And then over the weekend, I got an email from a colleague in Mexico, and they're using saliva tests there as well. So the growing consensus is it is as accurate, or if not more accurate, than sticking the swab up your nose, and certainly a lot easier to do. So I think we should. Yeah. But as Viviana said, if you've already got a test approved by your state that involves the swab, it's hard to change. It takes a lot of regulatory activity to change it. And a lot of places don't want to change, but I think we should go to saliva. I think it'd be way easier for people.
My goodness. Well, I'll just tell you personally, maybe this isn't right, but I don't really want to get I don't know if I can stick that swab up at the back of my nose by myself. I'd have someone else do it, but the CVS, you got to do it yourself. I don't know if I could do that.
Yeah, it's hard to do it yourself because as soon as you get a little pain, you're going to pull it out. Whereas if someone else is doing it, you have less of a choice.
Sit back and grip. I probably wouldn't do it enough, and then it would come back negative, and it wouldn't be accurate probably. Yeah. So, this goes back to the shedding. I've been reading a couple articles about is this virus airborne? And I'm like, hold on, guys. That was definitely we know it's airborne. What are these articles even talking about now about airborneness?
So let me explain. So airborne and droplet transmission are technically two different things, right? I know it's all going through the air. It sounds confusing, but when you talk and sneeze, you make droplets of different sizes, right? And the bigger ones fall to the ground within a few feet. And we think that's mostly how SARS-CoV-2 is transmitted. But when we say it's airborne or aerosolized, it's the really tiny droplets that can go long distances and remain suspended for a while. And so now WHO is suggesting that in some cases at least, you can get this fine droplet transmission, which means the droplets could stay suspended longer. And that would mainly happen in a closed space, in an office space maybe. Some people make fine droplets with a lot of virus in them. It's not clear to me at all that this is a majority of transmission. I think most of it is by those big droplets. That's why we say 6 feet, right? Stay 6 feet from someone because the big droplets are falling to the ground. Yeah.
Okay. Any idea? Well, I know you kind of were, I don't want to say skeptical, but a little about time it may spend in the air and have a high virology. I remember reading that measles can stay in the air for hours.
Yeah, so measles these tiny droplets, they can travel 100, 150 feet, right? And you can infect people at the back of a lecture hall, right? So that's really remarkable. I don't think they're staying suspended for hours. I think that's a bit much, right? But I do think they can travel longer distances, yeah.
Okay. Read a study about an antibody study in Spain that said 5.2% of residents in Spain have developed antibodies. So the point was that does not bode well for herd immunity or getting there anyway soon without that vaccine. What do you make of this?
Yeah, so Spain had a lot of infections, right? They managed to control it, but then after all that, only 5% of the population has antibodies. So, yeah, it's going to be hard to reach the 70%. However, you may have heard in a small neighborhood in New York City, in Queens, a small neighborhood called Corona.
No, Professor, listen, we have you here because you are a man of truth. You don't need to be making stuff up. The town's name is Corona?
Yeah, it's a little subset of Queens, Corona neighborhood.
Oh,
Yeah, they have
come on.
68% of the people there are seropositive, and that's because they're mostly working class people. They go to work throughout the whole outbreak. They got infected, so it shows that it can be achieved. Spain is unfortunately, there are a lot of people there who haven't been infected, and so I would say herd immunity is not unachievable. It's just hard because when you have to have a lot of people infected, then 20% of them will get really sick, and that's the issue.
Yeah. What do we know about like deaths in that neighborhood?
They got hard hit. They had a lot of deaths.
Okay.
Yes, one of the hardest hit
So
neighborhoods in New York City. Yeah.
Okay, so it was a hard road to get to that 68% even, which probably isn't even enough for herd immunity too.
That's the point. It's a hard road, right?
Okay. What's the latest with vaccines? I know you talked about Norovax and yeah. So what about that and some other vaccines?
So as you know, the U.S. has a program called Operation Warp Speed, where they are selecting 6 candidates and giving the companies a lot of money to start producing enough, 100 million doses, even before the vaccines have been tested. And that's hedging your bet, right? To make sure you have enough, because you have 350 million people in the U.S. You have to have multiple companies making vaccines because 100 million doses takes a long time to manufacture. So they're starting now. That's the point. And whether any of these 6 work or not, we don't know. But if they do, we have the doses ready to go. And that's probably, if you want to spend the billions, that's probably a good way to go.
That is interesting. So if it doesn't work, they just throw it away.
Yeah, maybe we could use it for research. Yes.
Yeah.
It would be a loss.
Interesting.
It would be a loss. But, compared to the economic losses, trillions of dollars, it's not a lot. So I agree that it's worth it. I just don't know what the criteria are for selecting these candidates, right? They're not really telling.
Well, yeah, I know. There's clearly there's opportunity for corruption there. So, do you know how many vaccines have been approved for that already?
About 6.
Okay. Wow. I wonder how many they're going to do.
I think that's it. I think only 6.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, I wonder if like in the next month or something, one pops up. They must.
They're all in human trials, or most of them are in human trials. It's going to be a while before we know, at least until the fall, whether any of them are effective or not. But if that happens, then they can, then they have to decide who to give it to first. And that's an interesting question. Who's going to get it?
Yeah.
Not me for sure. I'll be last on the list.
Why is that?
I'm just a nobody, right? I don't perform any essential functions. The doctors and nurses.
What do you mean?
And
You're here every Monday, Professor. What do you mean that you don't have essential functions? What's more essential than this?
I stay home pretty much, so my risk of infection is pretty low.
I see. Yeah. Professor, our office hours are coming to an end. Your office hours are. Give us a final thought that we should be keeping in mind here. Something you learned last week.
Well, I'm thinking a lot about school opening in the fall, right? And the consensus is that schools should open because kids do better when they're at school for many, many reasons. So I think we can get kids back to school, but we have to take certain precautions. You can't just let them go back as usual. That's not going to work. So we have to do a lot of testing, and we need some rapid tests. We could use an hour test. Wouldn't that be great if you could test every kid in the morning and with an hour, Johnny's infected, go home for 2 weeks. That would really be key. And this week I'm going to be talking to someone who's working on rapid tests. So I'm really looking forward to that. And so that's what we have to do.
Ivy League sports canceled all their fall seasons. I don't know what Columbia decided to do with their students, but it's got to be tough for the colleges too. How are you going to keep college kids from going to frat parties and all that stuff?
No, it's very hard. College is a difficult situation, but Columbia's open in the fall. They're going to have classes, and some colleges have canceled. Some of them are going to have classes. But at Columbia, they're giving the professors the option of whether you want to have in-person classes or Zoom classes.
What are you going to do?
Well, I don't teach in the fall. I teach in the spring. But I'll tell you, I want to have an in-person class in the spring. So if I have to, I'll wear a face mask. But I prefer to. I love seeing the kids in person. I can tell if they're learning by just looking at them. That's why I can tell if you're learning by looking at you too.
Well, my high school history teacher always said, if your head's like this, you're probably not paying attention. So she can tell if you're learning based on your head angle.
It's a good one. I
like try to always keep it like this. Professor, always good to talk to you, sir. This Week in Virology and Microbe TV, is that right?
That's right. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Microbe.tv. Yep. Professor Vincent Rackaniello from Columbia University. All right, that's our show. Slater Crusaders. Have a great day. See you tomorrow. Spread the word.